Today I want to share with you some information on using gouache paint, especially for beginners. I've only been using it about 1 year myself, coming from an oil paint and acrylic background. So as a beginner, I can tell you some of the things that I've noticed right offhand. And I'll first tell you there are different types of gouache. As you can see here, some of my supply, if it says acrylic gouache, that's going to be more like acrylic paint, and it will have different properties than the rest of the gouache. It's also more affordable, so some people might be tempted to buy it, but it will have different properties than the professional designer gouache. And here are some of my watercolors just to show you the difference in size. Some of my watercolors are about the same size, but a lot of the tubes come smaller. So as far as what I use, I like to use porcelain for gouache paint because it's easy to clean. And also, as you can see on the right side, that was my plastic palette, and it just stained so badly. And the porcelain not only doesn't stain, but it has some sort of repelling property so that it literally just glides across. It makes it really fun to mix the paints on. It's one of the joys actually of using gouache paint, is just watching how they flow as I'm mixing them. And so I really enjoy having the porcelain. They're kind of heavy and maybe more expensive and harder to travel with, so you might still need some plastic ones for portability if you're going to be out in maybe plein air doing landscape or something like that. But I do prefer the porcelain palettes. And as I said, this isn't really a technical how-to. I'll do more of those coming up in the future as far as how to paint, how I paint, and just some basic information for beginners on how to paint. But this is just more, I'm going to paint some flowers. They're tulips, and I'm just going to talk more again about the gouache paints and my experience with them going in 1 year. So I often start with pencil sketching, and that's just something that I prefer because I'm comfortable with it, and you could erase if you wanted to erase some lines, and I don't mind having lines, especially actually in my watercolors. I do like the pencil lines kind of showing through as the skeleton behind the flow. They actually give some, like a skeleton, some structure, especially with watercolor. It's not as important, I think, with gouache paint because watercolor is a lot more transparent than gouache paint. One of the main characteristics, it's basically watercolor paint that is opaque or non-transparent. Now, some of the colors can be transparent if you make them thin enough, and depending on the properties, I mean, I'd say all of them you can thin, and then you'll have a really transparent layer. But some of the colors, like ultramarine, is definitely more transparent, and the same with the oil paints. There's transparent glazing colors, and those will be the same colors that will be more transparent with gouache paint. Okay, so as you can see, I'm just laying down some colors, and these bright colors actually, it does look a little bit like watercolor paint on the first go, and there's no reason not to stop right here. One of the reasons I do, though, is I do like to get that depth and just more interest, and it will dry a little duller than it goes on. So that's something to remember too. So I'll talk more about that as we go along, because yeah, just remember as you go, it will look slightly different while wet than dry. And some of the differences could be also the edges might be more or less defined when it dries, and you might not notice that while you're painting it. All right, so I am painting I'm going to be doing some stylized art based on fairy tales, and this is coming from Hans Christian Andersen. This is my first go at it. He has a fairy tale called, it's not, yeah, I guess it could be a fairy tale, but it's called Little Ida's Flowers, and little Ida comes to her tutor and is sad because her bouquet of flowers has wilted. And her tutor tells her not to be sad because they are just tired because the flowers were at a ball dancing all night long. So I am trying to capture flowers dancing, and I probably will do some more dancing flowers. This is my first attempt, and they didn't really, I'm not going to add eyes or anything, but I would like to give the flowers some sort of movement where they look like they're dancing and definitely having a good time. Okay, so back to the painting in the gouache. Gouache. There you go. As you can see now how vibrant all these colors on the palette are, but I choose to really tone down a background, and why not just leave it white? And that's definitely a possibility. I prefer to do that more with watercolor for some reason than with gouache, because I feel like the watercolor, because of its transparency, it seems more suitable to a white background, and the gouache more stands out against the background. So I like to soften that contrast with a little bit of a background, even if it's just barely a value tone step above the paper. In fact, a lot of times, especially with such a vibrant painting like this, I don't want a too dark of a background because that would take away from the boldness of those bright orange and yellow flowers. But just a little subtle atmosphere in the background will help, I think, just bring the whole picture alive. And again, I'm trying to go for a more calm background because there's so much loud, bold color in the flowers and even in the leaves. They're pretty bright green because I chose to keep them bright because tulips usually have a lot of color in their leaves. It's springtime, so it's that fresh light. You got the chartreuse and the bright greens of springtime and renewal and fresh and young plants. All right, now here is something that some people really like in paintings is creating drips and effects with water, splatters, things like that, and that is really fun. And sometimes, especially as beginners, we don't realize it's more like a happy accident when it happens, and sometimes maybe it's like horror, like you didn't want that to happen, and sometimes it turns out well, and sometimes you might be disappointed. So like I said, it's part of the, I think, beauty of and benefit of the gouache and watercolors, but if you don't know how to control it, then it could be problematic. And while you can't control exactly when and how it will drip, you can definitely control certain things. For example, you can control the amount of water on your brush and on your paper. You can control the absorbency of your paper by, so by the time it started dripping like this, I had several layers, which created a barrier on the paper, which created a, I guess you could say, an avenue for it to travel. As you can see, I just added some spatters as well. So you can also control, and here I am, as you can see how easily this cleans up. And something I'll talk about in a few minutes is why I'm going to start over. It's day 2 of this painting, and well, I had added quite a bit of white to some of the paints, so I want to start fresh with fresh paint. But I have plenty still to use on my palette. I just want to make sure I have the darkest darks first, and then I work from dark to light, just like I do with oil paint. And it's usually the opposite of how I would work in watercolor, because watercolor is transparent and you can't put white on top of dark. So back to what I was saying about drips, and you can control the angle of your paper as well. So if you want a drip to go fast or slow, or maybe just not as far, less of an angle, you can have your paper angled 45 degrees if you really want a fast flowing drip. You can also control the amount of saturation or color in the drip by how much paint and the colors of paint that are in the drip. There's a lot of information about flow. Flow is really especially I think in watercolor paint, which is more transparent, a lot more effects. But you can definitely get flow effects with gouache paint as well. And that's basically working wet into wet. Now, one thing I do want to discuss is the fact that gouache paint can be re-wet. So if you go in and, unlike watercolor paint, if you go in and try to rework part of a painting, you will actually be reactivating the dry paint underneath the what you're trying to paint on, and it will mix and blend and maybe even turn into a muddy color that you didn't expect. And that's because gouache paint, like I said, is reactivated with water, and that's also something to keep in mind when you're done with it. You wouldn't want to try to restretch a gouache painting, because it's going to literally like you could do with watercolor paper. Let's say the paper is kind of got some bends in it and you decide you're going to restretch it. Well, if you tried to restretch the gouache paper, it would start to reactivate all the colors, and they would just start bleeding all over your paper. So you might even, some people might want to varnish their paper to finish it, just kind of like you would a charcoal painting or sketch. Alright, so one of the best things I think about the gouache painting is how you can shade and add highlights after the fact. You can put them on top of paint that's already laid down. And you can't do that with watercolor, because you just can't go back and make something light after you have well, the only way you can is if you do a painting that uses gouache paint for the highlights. Now, some watercolor artists use strictly watercolor, so they really have to plan ahead on their highlights and think about where they're going to be for that very reason. Anyway, this is just a basic, my experience with gouache paint. I hope this was helpful and that you enjoyed this video. Stay tuned. I hope to do more gouache, oil painting, and acrylics and watercolor in the future.